Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining me today for this webinar on defined benefit pension transfers. My name is Tom Selby. As you can see on the slide there, I'm a senior analyst at AJ Bell. So just a few details before we kick off. The value of your investments can go down as well as up, and you may get back less than you originally invested. We don't offer advice. This is crucial for this section on defined benefit pension transfers. So it's important you understand the risks. If you're unsure, please consult a suitably qualified financial advisor, and that's something that I'll be talking about in the presentation today. Tax treatment depends on your individual circumstances and rules may change. And as always, past performance is not a guide to future performance, and some investments need to be held for the long term. Right, so let's kick off with the presentation itself. So the things we're going to cover today, so the basics of what is a defined benefit pension and the state of the market and the kind of retirement benefits that people are offered at the moment. Why has the volume of DB transfers increased significantly, particularly since 2015? So that's people leaving their defined benefit schemes. We'll then take a look at the pension protection fund, which is an incredibly valuable underpin to your defined benefit pension entitlements. Finding an advisor, so if you're considering leaving your defined benefit scheme, then how you go about finding an advisor and the resources that are at your disposal. And finally, to end things, we'll look at the key factors that might influence you in your decision to either stay in a DB scheme or potentially leave it. So just to kick off, some basics of what is a defined benefit pension. So in the UK, we've seen a significant shift in the way that retirement benefits are provided to people. So historically, the system was fairly paternalistic. Most employers would offer you a guaranteed defined benefit pension as part of your employment contract. We're moving away from that now through primarily automatic enrolment towards a more individualistic system where it's up to you as an individual to manage your retirement outcomes. However, as I mentioned, historically, most employers offered employees access to a defined benefit pension. These are incredibly valuable pension benefits. The way that they work is that you build up entitlements to a certain amount of pension based on how long you've worked for the employer. And that's usually based on either your average salary throughout your career or even more generously, your final salary at the end. So a quick, simple example at the end there, just of how these arrangements work. So somebody who worked for 30 years in what's called a 60th final salary scheme. So there will be different fractions that will be used to work out the generosity of your benefits. If they ended up with a salary of £60,000 at the end of their career, then they will be entitled to an annual inflation protected pension of £30,000, so half of that amount. So fairly straightforward in terms of the basics. So just looking at the way that pension provision has shifted in the UK here. So we've got four graphs here that I'll quickly talk you through. So if you look in the top left corner, you can see a graph there showing the composition of pension scheme membership in the UK in millions. So what that shows is the slow death of private sector defined benefit pensions. So you can see defined benefit provision, the blue line there, withering on the vine, whereas recently, particularly post introduction of automatic enrolment, the number of savers in defined contribution schemes has increased substantially. If you look to the bottom right there, that chart, again, all these from the Office of National Statistics, shows the difference between private sector and public sector membership. So you've got public sector membership fairly stable, private sector membership declining, and then increasing as automatic enrolment is rolled out. And then finally, if you just look in the bottom left, this graph gives you an idea of why some big defined benefit schemes have suffered significant problems, and you've probably read some headlines about those. So you can see the rise in pensions in payment there, particularly in the private sector, as the amount of as baby boomers retire on those defined benefit pensions, the amount of pensions that need to be paid out has increased, and that has led to a surge in the liabilities of those private sector defined benefit scheme sponsors. So now, why has the volume of pension transfers gone through the roof in recent times? So on this slide, just to emphasize the significant change that we've seen in recent years. So this blue line charts the amount of money switching between pension schemes. So the line was, this graph only goes back to 2012, but the line was fairly flat right up until 2014 and through to 2015. What we've seen is a surge from that point. So you look at 2014, about 5 billion of pension transfers occurred during that year. Fast forward to 2017, and you're looking at close to £35 billion of transfers. So that's roughly a 7-fold increase in the amount of money transferred. Incidentally, we've recently had updated figures from the first quarter of 2018, which was actually another record in terms of the value of pension transfers. So somewhere around £10.6 billion was transferred. So fairly huge numbers, and there are some quite clear reasons why this is happening. So the most obvious reason being the pension freedom. So on the left there you can see former Chancellor, now newspaper proprietor, George Osborne, the man who unleashed the pension freedoms on the UK, moving us from a system where the vast majority of people were shoehorned into an annuity, which provides a guaranteed income for life, and now the vast majority of people enter drawdown where their money stays invested. So as you can see from the slide there, anybody from age 55 is able to withdraw up to 100% of their defined contribution pot, 25% of that being tax-free and 75% taxed at your marginal rate. Now clearly that's an attractive environment for savers. The level of flexibility and choice that's now available has clearly attracted people from the defined benefit market, and that's one of the reasons we've seen such a huge level of switching from DB to DC. Something that's talked about a little bit less but is incredibly important is the tax treatment on death in defined contribution schemes, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So broadly speaking, if you die before age 75 and you've got a defined contribution pot, it can be passed on tax-free to your beneficiary, provided you make a nomination within 2 years. It's passed on at their marginal rate of income tax if you die after the age of 75. Now, an important point to mention, if you have private sector guaranteed pension rights, and crucially, this applies only to the private sector. So if you're in a public sector final salary scheme, that's where final salary schemes tend to mainly exist now, then the government said that you cannot transfer out of that scheme. So you're essentially blocked from the pension freedoms. But if you're in a private sector scheme with guaranteed rights, so that's either a defined benefit scheme or an old insured policy with what's called a guaranteed annuity rate attached, which looks like a DB scheme and smells like a DB scheme, and as far as the regulator is concerned is treated like a DB scheme, then you have the right to transfer to a defined contribution scheme, although advice will need to be taken if that pension is valued at £30,000 or more. And again, we'll cover that in a little bit more detail as we move on with the presentation. Now, just in terms of what's going on in the market and why so many people are leaving DB schemes. So clearly we've seen the pension freedoms have made the defined contribution structure more attractive to lots of savers for all the reasons I highlighted on the previous slide. But we've also seen something of a perfect storm for DB transfers and different factors pushing people potentially to think about quitting their guaranteed defined benefit scheme. So in tandem with the freedoms we've seen, we've seen a number of high-profile corporate failures. So you can see in the top left there, probably the most notorious defined benefit failure of recent times, BHS and Sir Philip Green. We've also seen Carillion go to the wall, and their schemes, their pension members likely to fall into the pension protection funds. So some high-profile cases where people have seen their defined benefit, the sponsor of their defined benefit scheme fail, and as a result the pension members end up with lower pensions. As a result, they don't end up with nothing, and that's something I'll come on to in a further slide. At the same time, there's been if you see at the top right there, talk about the economic circumstances. So We've seen deficits generally on the rise, record low gilt yields pushing up the deficits of defined benefit schemes, and crucially, lots of headlines around the transfer values are on offer, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So liabilities of pension schemes have gone up as the amount, the liabilities, that's the amount that they estimate they'll need to pay in pensions throughout the life of the scheme's membership. As their liabilities go up, logically, the amount of money that they're willing to offer to get those liabilities off their balance sheet have also increased. So on to DB transfer values. So what is a DB transfer value? So you can see a couple of headlines on the right, which have potentially pushed people towards the exit door on defined benefit pensions. So one suggesting that defined pension transfer values, the amount that you're offered to leave the scheme, have increased by 40%. Another more bullshit headline saying why now is the time to cash in your final salary pension, which is incredibly strong. Now, because of the economic environment, what we've seen as the value, the amount of money that companies are willing to offer to get rid of you increase. Now, I see on this slide reports of 20 or 30 times the annual pension value. In fact, I've seen reports since I produced this of transfer values back in 2016 of higher that amount than those amounts, up to 35, even 40 times the annual pension value. Although most people, although those highs of those are probably the peak highs, and they may be going down from now onwards. So if we think of Julie on the first slide, so she might be offered a £600,000 lump sum. If you think of a 30 times annual pension value, even a £900,000 lump sum to give up her inflation protected guaranteed pension. So that's a huge amount of money for most people. It's money that they haven't seen before. Certainly one advisor I spoke to had a client who described it feeling like they'd won the lottery and was simply asking, where do I sign in terms of moving the money out? The key thing to think about here is that if they're offering you that amount of money to leave your scheme, there's a reason. And the reason is that your defined benefit pension is incredibly valuable, and you need to think carefully about how you would fund your retirement plans if you don't have that guaranteed income stream available. So just to emphasize that point, what we've got on the slide here is the index of the 7,800 schemes who are eligible to fall into the pension protection fund. That's the lifeboat fund that exists for defined benefit schemes when they go to the wall. So if you look at the light blue line, that shows the liabilities of those schemes, so the amount that they will have to pay out to all of their members, or the amount they think they'll have to pay out to all their members through retirement. And you can see there in April 2016 a significant spike in their measure of the liabilities that they'll need to pay out. As that spike hit in 2016, the amount they were willing to offer as a transfer value also increased. So a clear and present link between the liabilities and the transfer values being offered to pension scheme members. So I've mentioned a couple of times now the pension protection fund, and I think it's important to dwell on that briefly, as it's an often poorly understood part of the defined benefit framework and an incredibly valuable underpin to your defined benefit pension entitlement. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, I won't be able to go through the entire detail of how the PPF works, although if you are interested, there is a link on the bottom right of this slide. For those who can't see the screen, it's www.pensionprotectionfund.org.uk. But the important thing to take away from this is that if your sponsor falls into financial trouble, so as we saw with BHS, although that actually didn't fall into the pension protection fund in the end, or as we've seen more recently with Carillion, whose schemes are going to fall into the pension protection fund, you won't lose anything because of the existence of the PPF. So broadly, if your scheme falls into the PPF and you've reached your scheme's normal pension age, so that will be set out in your scheme documentation, usually around 65, you should receive 100% of your promised pension at that point in time. If you started drawing on your pension, so you're already in retirement, you'll usually still receive 90% of your promised pension, although a cap may be set on the amount that you can receive each year. An important point to note is that you may also lose valuable inflation protection in both those scenarios. So while, for example, in the first scenario, you may get 100% of your promised pension at that time, if there was a promise to pay to protect that pension from inflation for the rest of your retirement, that promise may be rescinded as a result of you falling into the PPF. So a valuable underpin, although ultimately if you are unfortunate enough to see your scheme sponsor go to the wall, then you will likely see a reduction in the amount of money that you get in retirement. Now, if you are considering leaving your private sector defined benefit scheme, then you'll need to consider finding a financial advisor. So as I mentioned briefly in an earlier slide, as part of the pension freedoms introduced in April 2015, the government decided that anybody who wants to switch from a DB scheme to a DC scheme where their benefits are valued at £30,000 or more, they'll be required by law to seek professional financial advice first. Now, an important point here, which isn't noted on the slide, the only requirement is that you seek professional advice, financial advice, and get proof that you've taken financial advice. You don't need to get a positive recommendation from the financial advisor in order to transfer your money. So if your financial advisor says, don't do it, I don't think it's a good idea to move, then you still have a right to transfer your money. Having said that, it's important that if you're going to take advice, and you will have to pay for financial advice, quite often costs a bit of money. It might be somewhere north of £1,000. You might as well listen to what they have to say, because they are professionals, they know what they're doing, and engage with the recommendations they give you. They'll have your best interests at heart. And if you're being given a clear signal that it's not in your best interest to leave your DB pension, then that should be a significant part of your considerations when deciding whether or not to stay in the scheme. An important point to note at the bottom here, so different charging methods. So if you're going to an advisor and considering leaving your defined benefit scheme, then there's broadly two different charges that you might encounter. One is an upfront fee. So the advisor will say to you, you need to pay me X £1,000 for this advice, and I will provide you with that advice, and you'll pay whether or not the recommendation is to transfer out or to stay in. And another is contingent charging, whereby you will only pay for the advice if the advice is for you to transfer out. Now, both those charging methods are perfectly valid, but you should be alive to the inherent conflict of interest that exists where a contingent charging model is applied. Clearly, in that case, the advisor is only paid if you move your money. It's not a reason to not pay in that format. As I say, the regulator allows it. There's nothing wrong with it, just something for you to be aware of. In terms of resources, so there are a couple here on the right-hand side. So pension-wise, the government's guidance service, a useful place for you to look for all retirement-related issues, including those related to financial advice. So that's www.pensionwise.gov.uk. If you're trying to find a local advisor, then the most well-known source and well-used source would be www.unbiased.co.uk. One point to note, and I'm sure some of you who've attempted to access financial advice will have experienced this. Many advisors are unwilling, for various reasons to do with risk and regulation, to offer defined benefit transfer advice. So you may find a problem in finding someone to take on your case if you want to leave your defined benefit scheme. Unfortunately, there's a little bit can be done about this. You'll simply have to phone as many advisors you can, contact as many advisors you can, and eventually, hopefully, you'll find somebody who is willing to speak to you about your transfer. Now, on to the crux of the presentation, I guess. Should you stay or should you leave your defined benefit scheme? Now, clearly, there are lots of complicated things that you need to think about and discuss with your financial advisor before making that decision. But I've just listed some of the key considerations that will push you in one direction or another. So why you might consider leaving your defined benefit scheme. As I mentioned in the earlier slide, defined contribution pensions are now entirely flexible from age 55, so you can invest and spend your money how you like. Equally, you can decide to take all of your money out if you want to, albeit 75% of your withdrawal will be taxed in the same way as income. Defined benefit pensions, while incredibly valuable, do provide a rigid straight line guaranteed level of income. So for some people, the preference will be to spend more money in the early years of retirement, perhaps when they're more active, and then perhaps to reduce spending as they go on and maybe increase spending towards the end, what's known as a kind of U-shaped retirement income curve. It's a perfectly logical thing to do, although if you are planning to leave your DB scheme and spend more money in the early years of DC while also taking investment risk, you need to be alive to the risk of what's known as pound cost ravaging, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on what that means on the next slide. Another reason you may want to leave, inheritance planning. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, the way that defined contribution pensions like SIPs are treated on death has become much more generous than it was in the past. So if you die before age 75, it can be passed on to your beneficiaries tax-free. After 75, it'll be taxed at their marginal rate of income tax, whereas with a DB pension, you usually get a spouse's pension of at least 50%. But if you've got significant levels of guaranteed income elsewhere, either if you're still in work or you have income from a property or from other sources, and you feel that you won't need your defined benefit pension to live on in retirement, and your priority is to pass funds on to loved ones, then that is one reason why a lot of people have moved from defined benefit to defined contribution. So some serious things to think about there, but that is one of the key factors that have affected people's decision making. Serious ill health. So if you've been diagnosed with terminal cancer or another serious illness, diabetes, anything that's likely to limit your life, then it's possible you'll be able to get more income in a defined contribution environment than in the flat defined benefit environment, which doesn't take into account your health circumstances. So you could, for example, buy an enhanced annuity if an insurance company believes that you're only going to live for a limited number of years. Then the money that you move out of a defined benefit scheme might be able to provide you with a higher guaranteed income from an insurer if you switch to DC, defined contribution, and then move it into an annuity. Equally, if you know you're not going to live as long as your DB scheme thinks you're going to live for, then you may want to put it into drawdown and manage your own investments and take bigger withdrawals as a result. But again, that's only if you're in serious ill health. And the final point, if you're worried about your employer's solvency, so again, as we saw with the cases of BHS and Carillion, and there will be other companies on the high street and elsewhere who are responsible for paying defined benefit pensions, who will go to the wall. If you're worried about the employer's solvency, you're aware of the pension protection fund, but you'd rather have control of your money and protect yourself against the cuts in benefits that you would experience, albeit limited cuts in the PPF, then that's another reason why some people would potentially consider leaving the guaranteed defined benefit scheme. Now, I mentioned pound cost ravaging on the previous slide. This is a worked example that we put together here at AJ Bell using real historical data, just to give you an idea of how that could work. So on the graph here, what we're looking at is a £100,000 pension fund invested in the FTSE All Share. All three lines showing the same thing, withdrawals at £10,000 per year. Now, the only difference between these three different lines is the point at which the individuals started taking their withdrawals. So if we look at the green, well, let's focus on the green line and the red line, because I think they showed the point most clearly. So the green line, so again, this is £100,000 pension fund invested in the FTSE All Share, 10,000 withdrawals per year, total charges of 1%. Over the period from 2009 up until December 2017, they would have received £90,000 of income following that strategy, and the fund would be worth approximately £114,000 after that 9-year period. Now, that looks like a pretty decent outcome by anyone's standard. Obviously, they benefited from the post credit crunch increase in asset prices, an 8-year bull market run that's still running, and that drawdown strategy looks to have worked quite well. However, if you look at the red line, so that's somebody following exactly the same strategy but just starting 2 years earlier, back in 2007. Clearly you can see there the impact of the market dip and the long-term implications that has for that person's retirement income strategy. So the same amount of money, but they've taken just more in income, so £100,000, but the fund's almost been exhausted after that 10-year period. So the green line, same strategy, just happens to be 2 years later. They look like they've got a sustainable retirement income withdrawal strategy that could potentially last for many more years into the future. Having started just after the financial crisis, somebody who just happened to start just before the financial crisis has almost run out of money after 10 years and will have to potentially think of living on other sources of income, or in a worst case scenario, simply what they get back from the state. So some reasons why you should probably stay in your defined benefit pension scheme. So that for the vast majority of people, remaining in a DB scheme is the right course of action, and here are some of the reasons why. First of all, inflation protection. So inflation protection, an incredibly valuable benefit, and I've just highlighted that with a couple of numbers here. So again, if you think about a £30,000 guaranteed income with a 50% spouse's pension and inflation protection. So that's a pretty standard defined benefit pension structure. That would cost a 65-year-old around £950,000 to buy from an insurance company through an annuity. So these quotes are from the Money Advice Service on Annuity Calculator, which is an incredibly useful tool actually if you're considering buying an annuity. If you took the same income and the same guarantees and just removed the inflation protection, then it would cost you almost £400,000 left. So that just shows the value of an inflation protection add-on to an insurance policy or to a defined benefit scheme over a long period of time. As I've mentioned, the spouse's pensions, that's something that will come with the vast majority of defined benefit pensions, meaning that your significant other will get at least 50% of the value of your pension until if you die before she does. That's incredibly valuable. As I went through in a bit of detail earlier, you have the pension protection fund underpin as well as a guaranteed income for life. So obviously most people now building up pensions in defined contribution. The idea of having an income that is guaranteed by an employer has all but disappeared in the UK outside of the public sector. So what you have, if you've got a guaranteed income, is something that's incredibly valuable and something that can give you a very good starting point in planning your life after retirement. No investment risk and incredibly low maintenance. So I mentioned on the previous slide, pound cost ravaging. You don't have to worry about that risk if you're in a defined benefit scheme. Equally, you don't have to worry about things like inflation risk because your fund will be protected against inflation, and a lot of the other risks that you need to manage if you're a defined contribution scheme won't exist in a defined benefit scheme. And finally, a slightly more techie one, you get more favourable tax treatment if you're in a defined benefit scheme. You've got a reasonable size pot. So the amount of money that you can save over your lifetime in a defined contribution or defined benefit scheme is controlled by the lifetime allowance. That's set at just over £1 million at the moment. So if you're in a defined contribution scheme and your pension is valued at over £1 million, then that's just over £1.03 million. That's the limit of the tax-free amount that you can save in that environment. It's a bit different for defined contribution schemes. So clearly there isn't a pot of money. So the way that they work out the value of your defined benefit scheme is using a factor, and that factor is 20 to 1. So if you think of how that would be applied, a pension that's worth about £50,000 a year from age 65, multiply that by 20, that would get you to somewhere near the £1 million lifetime allowance. Now, if you go back to the top of the slide, you see that £30,000 of guaranteed income in the private sector could buy you £950,000. So you wouldn't be able to get much more than an equivalent to your defined benefit pension of £30,000 in the form of an annuity, whereas if you're in a DB scheme, you can have a guaranteed income of up to £50,000. You essentially you benefit from a higher lifetime allowance if you're in a defined benefit scheme versus being in a defined contribution scheme. So if you have a benefit that's worth probably just over £30,000 or more in a year or more in a DB scheme, then you need to consider the implications it will have for the tax you pay if you breach that lifetime allowance. So just a quick summary of the stuff we've gone through, and then we'll get on to any questions you might have. So as we saw in the earlier slides, defined benefit pensions have all but disappeared in the private sector, although they exist in the public sector. Other public sector workers cannot transfer into defined contribution schemes. The reason that they've disappeared is because they cost employers so much money, and clearly if they cost employers so much money, then they are valuable to you. In most cases, you'd be better off staying put in a defined benefit pension scheme, although you do have the right to transfer. If you're going to transfer, and your pot's worth £30,000 or more, you'll need to speak to a qualified, regulated financial advisor. You don't have to follow that advice, but you will need to speak to an advisor and get proof that you've spoken to them before you move out of your scheme. If you think about transferring, you need to consider how you're going to fund your retirement without that guaranteed income. Your money will be invested in drawdown, and you'll be taking investment risk, inflation risk, longevity risk, and other risks beside those as well. And you need to consider what would happen if markets go south. So clearly nobody knows when the next market crash is going to happen, but if history's told us anything, is that it will happen at some point. And if you're taking a significant income from your fund and your money is invested and you're taking risk, then there is potential for you to end up with a suboptimal retirement outcome. And a final point there, very, very important, if you're going to transfer out, if your pot's worth £30,000 or more and you're going to take advice, then listen and engage with your advisor. You're paying for it, you might be paying a substantial amount for it. If you have to take it, then don't ignore what they say, because it could be extremely valuable to you. Thank you very much for listening. I think we've got about 10 minutes now for any questions that you may have on the back of that, or on anything else indeed. Okay, so the first question has come in, and it's on the volume of defined benefit pension transfers. So I think that was on one of the earlier slides. So do you think the volume of pension transfers will continue to increase? That's a very good question. So clearly we've seen a huge surge in the amount of money being transferred out of defined benefit pensions since the pension freedoms. Various reasons that's happened: the attractiveness of defined contribution, the economic circumstances, and many other things besides. Whether that's going to continue, I think we've probably reached something of a peak in defined benefit pension transfers now. So we saw about 10.6 billion moved out in the first quarter of 2018, as the number of people in defined benefit transfers in defined benefit schemes, reduces. That's going to naturally reduce as the number of people as the number of those schemes on offer disappear. Then the amount of those transfers taking place is likely to reduce. Okay, so we've got a couple of people here asking whether advice has to be taken when the annual pension or the total pension of the total value of the defined benefit pension fund is worth more than £30,000. So to be absolutely clear, it's if the total value of the DB pension fund is worth more than £30,000. So you'll go to your scheme and they'll give you a transfer value for the entire thing. And if that transfer value is over £30,000, then you'll need to speak to a financial advisor in terms of what it will depend on the valuation that they put on it as to what annual income that will be, but it will tend to be reasonably low. So if you think of a defined benefit scheme trying to work out how long you're going to live for, if a defined benefit scheme thinks that you're going to live from 65 for 30 years, for example, then it might be an annual pension of as little as £1,000 a year that requires you to take a DB transfer advice, but your scheme will provide you with details of its value. So one question here, how do you know if your DB scheme is covered by the PPF? A very important question. All private sector defined benefit pension schemes in the UK are covered by the Pension Protection Fund. That's an incredibly important point. So if you have a DB benefit and you're worried about the solvency of your employer, either now or into the future, so the ability of your employer to continue to pay out your pension as long as you live, then you will be covered by the PPF. But as I mentioned, you may get back less. You may get back less than the value of your pension, because you're likely to lose some inflation protection depending on the individual circumstances. And if you're not already in receipt of your pension, then it's likely that you'll see a 10% cut in the value of your pension at that point in time. So another question here. So how does the scheme provider decide the multiple to use when offering you a transfer value? Again, another good question. It will depend on numerous factors, but the basis of it should be how long they believe you're going to be in receipt of that pension through retirement. So if they think you're going to be in, so say if it's, let's go to a simple example. So if you've got a £1,000 defined benefit pension from age 65, and they think you're going to be in receipt of it for 30 years. Now, if that's got inflation protection and spouse's benefit attached to it, then it's likely that they'll offer you somewhere in the region of £45,000 or £50,000. Each scheme will have different factors that it considers when offering you a defined a transfer value for your scheme. So it's important that you take those into account, and that's something your financial advisor should be able to give you some detailed help with. So a question here, are DB schemes keen to offload their members to reduce their liabilities? So that's a nice, easy one. The answer is yes. The only reason that companies offer a pension transfer, will offer you a transfer, but A, you have a right to transfer out, but B, most companies are absolutely desperate to get defined benefit pension risk off their balance sheet. Certainly, if you go through any set of company accounts where there's an employer that has an old DB scheme, particularly one with a significant deficit, those companies know the vast majority of companies, certainly the FTSE 100 and significant private sector companies, simply don't want to have that risk on their balance sheet any longer. They don't want to have to spend time guessing how long you're going to live for and how long you're going to be in receipt for, and so they want to get rid of you from that scheme. So simple answer, yes. So an interesting one here, how much effect do you think a rise in interest rates will have on transfer values? It's difficult to say. Clearly, nobody has a crystal ball. We don't know when interest rates are going to rise or by how much, but clearly there's a link, a substantial link between interest rates and gilt yields and the liabilities that schemes report, and as a result the transfer values that you are offered. Now, what you might find actually that it's not, it won't just be a rise in interest rates and a rise in gilt yields that leads to a fall in liabilities. It will also be an expectation of that happening. So as schemes, if schemes think interest rates are more likely to go up, then they might suppress the value, the transfer value that they offer to you in anticipation of that happening. But the extent of the effect, I'm afraid it's a bit of a wait and see. I certainly I was skeptical about some of the aggressiveness of some of the headlines, should I say, that we saw in 2016, suggesting this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to transfer out of your defined benefit scheme. The transfer value that you're offered is essentially fair value. It's what that scheme thinks it needs to pay you in order for you to accept it, in order for you to get off its liabilities. So whether or not interest rates coming down the track and the impact that will have on transfer values, it is difficult, unfortunately, to say at this point in time. So a question here around advice. So how much would you expect advice to cost? That's a difficult question to answer. So there are over 20,000 financial advisors in the UK, and they'll offer different services based on their experience and expertise and skills and all the rest of it. So in terms of a defined benefit transfer, unfortunately, it's hard to give a flat figure of this is what you should expect to pay for a defined benefit transfer. I think the important thing is to shop around for advisors. So just like you should shop around for a platform provider, shop around for your SIP, you should shop around the market for a financial advisor, get a series of quotes from those advisors on what they're willing to offer you and the price that they're willing to offer you, and then make a decision based on that. You should set your, and one important point to know actually is that most advisors will give you a free consultation to start with, so they won't provide you with the advice in that session, clearly, because that's how they need to make their money and pay their bills. But you'll be able to usually get a 1 hour, something between a 30-minute and a 1 hour consultation at the start of your advice session to decide whether advice is for you or not. And then during that conversation, you can work out exactly how much they're going to charge you and whether you think that's value for money. So another question on advice here: is there any requirement to actually pay an IFA to execute a transfer into a SIP? So no, there is. So the requirement, clearly, financial advisor is going to charge for advising you. The question of whether or not that advisor will execute the transfer into a SIP on your behalf is an interesting one. So there's been a lot of debate around what's an issue that's been labelled as insistent clients. So that is people, that may be yourself, it may not be, who go to our advisor, say, I would like to transfer my defined benefit scheme, please. The advisor says no. The person says, I want to do that anyway, so they become insistent. And then whether or not the advisor is willing and able to move that money on their behalf, having said that it's not a good idea. A lot of advisors won't touch that kind of business with a barge pole. Frankly, a lot of advisors are incredibly concerned that somewhere down the line, even if they've signed insistent client documentation which says that this wasn't their advice and you're going against their wishes and you might lose out, they're still worried that at some point further down the line a complaint will be made by somebody who loses out as a result of a defined benefit pension transfer and goes to perhaps the Financial Ombudsman Service as a result, and they're worried that that liability will come back to bite them in 10 or 15 years time, or perhaps even longer. So clearly there's no requirement to pay an IFA for the advice that they offer you, but a lot of advisors won't be willing to execute the transfer on your behalf once you've received that advice. Okay, so I've just been handed a note, so that is all we have time for. Thank you for everybody for tuning in. Thanks for all the questions. I'm so sorry that I didn't get to a few of those that were sent through to me, but I'd be happy to take. So if you feel your question hasn't been answered, or you had a question and we didn't have time to cover it, then feel free to drop me an email. My email address is tom.selby@ajbell.co.uk. And if you're happy and if you feel you need some more help or some more guidance, then I'll do my best to assist you. So thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking to you soon. Take care.